Wages by the piece are nothing else than a converted form of wages by time, just as wages by time are a converted form of the value or price of labor power. In piece wages it seems at first sight as if the use value bought from the laborer was not the function of his labor power, living labor, but labor already realized in the product, and as if the price of this labor was determined, not as with time wages, by the fraction daily value of labor power, the working day of a given number of hours, but by the capacity for work of the producer. The confidence that trusts in this appearance ought to receive a first severe shock from the fact that both forms of wages exist side by side, simultaneously in the same branches of industry. The compositors of London, as a general rule, work by the piece, time work being the exception, while those in the country work by the day, the exception being work by the piece. The shipwrights of the Port of London work by the job or piece, while those of all other parts work by the day. In the same saddlery shops of London, often for the same work, piece wages are paid to the French, time wages to the English. In the regular factories in which throughout piece wages predominate, particular kinds of work are unsuitable to this form of wage, and are therefore paid by time. But it is, moreover, self-evident that the difference of form in the payment of wages alters in no way their essential nature, although the one form may be more favorable to the development of capitalist production than the other. Let the ordinary working day contain hours of which are paid, unpaid. Let its value product be shillings, that of 1 hour's labor therefore. Let us suppose that, as the result of experience, a laborer who works with the average amount of intensity and skill, who, therefore, gives in fact only the time socially necessary to the production of an article, supplies in hours pieces, either distinct products or measurable parts of a continuous whole. Then the value of these pieces, after subtraction of the portion of constant capital contained in them, is shillings, and the value of a single piece. The laborer receives a half-d per piece and thus earns in hours shilling. Just as, with time wages, it does not matter whether we assume that the laborer works hours for himself and hours for the capitalist, or half of every hour for himself, and the other half for the capitalist, so here it does not matter whether we say that each individual piece is half paid and half unpaid for, or that the price of pieces is the equivalent only of the value of the labor power, whilst in the other pieces surplus value is incorporated. The form of piece wages is just as irrational as that of time wages. Whilst in our example 2 pieces of a commodity, after subtraction of the value of the means of production consumed in them, are worth, as being the product of 1 hour, the laborer receives for them a price of. Piece wages do not, in fact, distinctly express any relation of value. It is not, therefore, a question of measuring the value of the piece by the working time incorporated in it, but on the contrary, of measuring the working time the laborer has expended by the number of pieces he has produced. In time wages, the labor is measured by its immediate duration. In piece wages, by the quantity of products in which the labor has embodied itself during a given time. The price of labor time itself is finally determined by the equation: value of a day's labor equals daily value of labor power. Piece wage is, therefore, only a modified form of time wage. Let us now consider a little more closely the characteristic peculiarities of piece wage. The quality of the labor is here controlled by the work itself, which must be of average perfection if the piece price is to be paid in full. Piece wages become, from this point of view, the most fruitful source of reductions of wages and capitalistic cheating. They furnish to the capitalist an exact measure for the intensity of labor. Only the working time which is embodied in a quantum of commodities determined beforehand and experimentally fixed counts as socially necessary working time and is paid as such. In the larger workshops of the London tailors, therefore, a certain piece of work, a waistcoat, is called an hour, or half an hour the hour. By practice it is known how much is the average product of 1 hour. With new fashions, repairs, and a contest arises between master and laborer as to whether a particular piece of work is 1 hour, and so on, until here also experience decides. Similarly in the London furniture workshops, and if the laborer does not possess the average capacity, if he cannot in consequence supply a certain minimum of work per day, he is dismissed. Given piece wage, it is naturally the personal interest of the laborer to strain his labor power as intensely as possible. This enables the capitalist to raise more easily the normal degree of intensity of labor. It is moreover now the personal interest of the laborer to lengthen the working day, since with it his daily or weekly wages rise. This gradually brings on a reaction like that already described in time wages, without reckoning that the prolongation of the working day, even if the piece wage remains constant, includes of necessity a fall in the price of the labor. In time wages, with few exceptions, the same wage holds for the same kind of work, whilst in piece wages, though the price of the working time is measured by a certain quantity of product, the day's or week's wage will vary with the individual differences of the laborers, of whom one supplies in a given time the minimum of product only, another the average, a third more than the average. With regard to actual receipts there is, therefore, great variety according to the different skill, strength, energy, staying power, and of the individual laborer. Of course, this does not alter the general relations between capital and wage labor. First, the individual differences balance one another in the workshop as a whole, which thus supplies in a given working time the average product, and the total wages paid will be the average wages of that particular branch of industry. Second, the proportion between wages and surplus value remains unaltered, since the mass of surplus labor supplied by each particular laborer corresponds with the wage received by him. But the wider scope that piece wage gives to individuality tends to develop on the one hand that individuality, and with it the sense of liberty, independence, and self-control of the laborers, and on the other, their competition one with another. Piecework has, therefore, a tendency, while raising individual wages above the average, to lower this average itself. But where a particular rate of piece wage has for a long time been fixed by tradition, and its lowering, therefore, presented especial difficulties, the masters, in such exceptional cases, sometimes had recourse to its compulsory transformation into time wages. Hence, in a great strike among the ribbon weavers of Coventry, piece wage is finally one of the chief supports of the hour system, described in the preceding chapter. The real earnings of the cotton weaver are now far less than they were. His superiority over the common laborer, which at first was very great, has now almost entirely ceased. Indeed, the difference in the wages of skillful and common labor is far less now than at any former period. How little the increased intensity and extension of labor through piece wages benefited the agricultural proletariat. The following passage, borrowed from a work on the side of the landlords and farmers, shows. By far the greater part of agricultural operations is done by people who are hired for the day or on piecework. Their weekly wages are about, and although it may be assumed that a man earns on piecework under the greater stimulus to labor, or perhaps more than on weekly wages, yet it is found, on calculating his total income, that his loss of employment during the year outweighs this gain. Further, it will generally be found that the wages of these men bear a certain proportion to the price of the necessary means of subsistence, so that a man with 2 children is able to bring up his family without recourse to parish relief. Malthus at that time remarked with reference to the facts published by Parliament, "I confess that I see, with misgiving, the great extension of the practice of piece wage. Really hard work during or hours of the day, or for any longer time, is too much for any human being." In the workshops under the Factory Acts, piece wages become the general rule, because capital can there only increase the efficacy of the working day by intensifying labor. With the changing productiveness of labor, the same quantum of product represents a varying working time. Therefore, piece wage also varies, for it is the money expression of a determined working time. In our example above, pieces were produced in hours, whilst the value of the product of the hours was the daily value of the labor power, the price of the labor hour, and the wage for one piece a half-d. In one piece half an hour's labor was absorbed. If the same working day now supplies, in consequence of the doubled productiveness of labor, pieces instead of, and all other circumstances remain unchanged, then the piece wage falls from a half-d. Divided by, as every piece now only represents divided by, instead of a half of a working hour. By a half-d equals, and in like manner by divided by equals. In other words, piece wage is lowered in the same proportion as the number of the pieces produced in the same time rises, and therefore, as the working time spent on the same piece falls. This change in piece wage, so far purely nominal, leads to constant battles between capitalist and labor, either because the capitalist uses it as a pretext for actually lowering the price of labor, or because increased productive power of labor is accompanied by an increased intensity of the same, or because the laborer takes seriously the appearance of piece wages and therefore revolts against a lowering of wages, unaccompanied by a lowering in the selling price of the commodity. The operatives carefully watch the price of the raw material and the price of manufactured goods, and are thus enabled to form an accurate estimate of their master's profits. The capitalist rightly knocks on the head such pretensions as gross errors as to the nature of wage labor. He cries out against this usurping attempt to lay taxes on the advance of industry, and declares roundly that the productiveness of labor does not concern the laborer at all. In the 8th chapter, we were occupied with the manifold combinations which may bring about a change in magnitude of the value of labor power, this magnitude being considered either absolutely or relatively, as compared with surplus value, whilst on the other hand, the quantum of the means of subsistence in which the price of labor is realized might again undergo fluctuations independent of, or different from, the changes of this price. As has been already said, the simple translation of the value, or respectively of the price, of labor power into the exoteric form of wages transforms all these laws into laws of the fluctuations of wages. That which appears in these fluctuations of wages within a single country as a series of varying combinations may appear in different countries as contemporaneous difference of national wages. In the comparison of the wages in different nations, we must therefore take into account all the factors that determine changes in the amount of the value of labor power, the price and the extent of the prime necessaries of life as naturally and historically developed, the cost of training the laborers, the part played by the labor of women and children, the productiveness of labor, its extensive and intensive magnitude. Even the most superficial comparison requires the reduction first of the average day wage for the same trades, in different countries, to a uniform working day. After this reduction to the same terms of the day wages, time wage must again be translated into piece wage, as the latter only can be a measure both of the productivity and the intensity of labor. In every country there is a certain average intensity of labor below which the labor for the production of a commodity requires more than the socially necessary time, and therefore does not reckon as labor of normal quality. Only a degree of intensity above the national average affects, in a given country, the measure of value by the mere duration of the working time. This is not the case on the universal market, whose integral parts are the individual country. The average intensity of labor changes from country to country. Here it is greater, there less. These national averages form a scale, whose unit of measure is the average unit of universal labor. The more intense national labor, therefore, as compared with the less intense, produces in the same time more value, which expresses itself in more money. But the law of value in its international application is yet more modified by the fact that, on the world market, the more productive national labor reckons also as the more intense, so long as the more productive nation is not compelled by competition to lower the selling price of its commodities to the level of their value. In proportion as capitalist production is developed in a country, in the same proportion do the national intensity and productivity of labor there rise above the international level. The different quantities of commodities of the same kind, produced in different countries in the same working time, have therefore unequal international values, which are expressed in different prices, in sums of money varying according to international values. The relative value of money will, therefore, be less in the nation with more developed capitalist mode of production than in the nation with less developed. It follows, then, that the nominal wages, the equivalent of labor power expressed in money, will also be higher in the first nation than in the second, which does not at all prove that this holds also for the real wages, for the means of subsistence placed at the disposal of the laborer. But even apart from these relative differences of the value of money in different countries, it will be found frequently that the daily or weekly, etc., wage in the first nation is higher than in the second, whilst the relative price of labor, the price of labor as compared both with surplus value and with the value of the product, stands higher in the second than in the first. J.W. Cowell, member of the Factory Commission after careful investigation of the spinning trade, came to the conclusion that in England wages are virtually lower to the capitalist, though higher to the operative than on the continent of Europe. The English factory inspector, Alexander Redgrave, in his report of Oct. T. proves by comparative statistics with continental states that in spite of lower wages and much longer working time, continental labor is, in proportion to the product, dearer than English. An English manager of a cotton factory in Oldenburg declares that the working time there lasted from 2 Saturdays included, and that the workpeople there, when under English overlookers, did not supply during this time quite so much product as the English in ours, but under German overlookers much less. Wages are much lower than in England, in many cases per cent, but the number of hands in proportion to the machinery was much greater, in certain departments in the proportion of. Mr. Redgrave gives very full details as to the Russian cotton factory. The data were given him by an English manager until recently employed there. On this Russian soil, so fruitful of all infamies, the old horrors of the early days of English factories are in full swing. The managers are, of course, English, as the native Russian capitalist is of no use in factory business. Despite all overwork, continued day and night, despite the most shameful underpayment of the workpeople, Russian manufacture manages to vegetate only by prohibition of foreign competition. It is well known that in Eastern Europe as well as in Asia, English companies have undertaken the construction of railways, and have, in making them, employed side by side with the native laborers, a certain number of English workingmen. Compelled by practical necessity, they thus have had to take into account the national difference in the intensity of labor, but this has brought them no loss. Their experience shows that even if the height of wages corresponds more or less with the average intensity of labor, the relative price of labor varies generally in the inverse direction. The conversion of a sum of money into means of production and labor power is the first step taken by the quantum of value that is going to function as capital. This conversion takes place in the market, within the sphere of circulation. The second step, the process of production, is complete so soon as the means of production have been converted into commodities whose value exceeds that of their component parts, and therefore contains the capital originally advanced, plus a surplus value. These commodities must then be thrown into circulation. They must be sold, their value realized in money, this money afresh converted into capital, and so over and over again. This circular movement, in which the same phases are continually gone through in succession, forms the circulation of capital. The first condition of accumulation is that the capitalist must have contrived to sell his commodities, and to reconvert into capital the greater part of the money so received. In the following pages, we shall assume that capital circulates in its normal way. The detailed analysis of the process will be found in Book II. The capitalist who produces surplus value, who extracts unpaid labor directly from the laborers and fixes it in commodities, is indeed the first appropriator, but by no means the ultimate owner of this surplus value. He has to share it with capitalists, with landowners, and who fulfill other functions in the complex of social production. Surplus value, therefore, splits up into various parts. Its fragments fall to various categories of persons, and take various forms, independent the one of the other, such as profit, interest, merchant's profit, rent, and it is only in Book III that we can take in hand these modified forms of surplus value. On the one hand, then, we assume that the capitalist sells at their value the commodities he has produced, without concerning ourselves either about the new forms that capital assumes while in the sphere of circulation, or about the concrete conditions of reproduction hidden under these forms. On the other hand, we treat the capitalist producer as owner of the entire surplus value, or, better perhaps, as the representative of all the sharers with him in the booty. We therefore, first of all consider accumulation from an abstract point of view, as a mere phase in the actual process of production. So far as accumulation takes place, the capitalist must have succeeded in selling his commodities, and in reconverting the sale money into capital. Moreover, the breaking up of surplus value into fragments neither alters its nature, nor the conditions under which it becomes an element of accumulation. Whatever be the proportion of surplus value which the industrial capitalist retains for himself, or yields up to others, he is the one who, in the first instance, appropriates it. We therefore assume no more than what actually takes place. On the other hand, the simple fundamental form of the process of accumulation is obscured by the incident of the circulation which brings it about, and by the splitting up of surplus value. An exact analysis of the process, therefore, demands that we should, for a time, disregard all phenomena that hide the play of its inner mechanism.